So this is a choose my build that Pineapple wanted to see, submitted their 250,000 channel points, and wanted me to play anything that had hammers revolving around my head, and wanted me to be a paladin. So this is what we came up with. I think it's a pretty stock standard build. It's way more standard than the previous choose my build thing that we did in last Epoch. That was the tornado Eye of the Storm thing from a couple builds ago. But this one is just using hammers, right? So I didn't know much going into this. We've gotten a lot of help from Twitch chat telling us what we should and should not spec into. But initially we leveled up using hammer throw, and I've seen a couple like highlight videos of like people dying and getting cool stuff. And in those videos they always seem to have like smite going off as well. So I asked chat about that. And apparently this is the key to it. So you're probably familiar with this already. This rolls from 4 to 9%, and I've got some pretty mediocre ones. This one's 5%, but it's chance to cast Smite when you hit with a throwing attack. So if you're familiar with Path of Exile, you might call this like cast on crit or maybe cast on hit. But we're triggering stuff with hammers, and then now that we have 4 of these, we're using Smite as our entire source of DPS. So we leveled up until like maybe level 65 or so. We had 3 of these when we ended the campaign, which is apparently quite lucky. And now we've transitioned over to being like full-time Smite. And we just hit Empowered Monoliths a minute ago. Right. I wanted to do this highlight right now because Pineapple just showed up back in chat. And I'm going to like low-key flex all of our gear, because we've had some insane RNG over the past hour or so. So we solved all of our mana problems by getting this helmet. There's a crit avoid base with a crit avoid suffix, but then it also has 6 mana gained on Smite use. So because we're triggering Smite all the time, every time that our hammer hits, it's got about a 30% chance right now of triggering Smite, and then Smite returns mana to us, so we can sustain our mana when we're hitting stuff, right? There's a node in the Mastery skill tree that's pretty similar to this. It's like Time and Faith. This says when you directly use Smite, and it costs, I guess it recovers 2 mana whenever you directly use it, but we're not directly using it. So in the past, Smite was bugged, and it would work even if you were triggering it. Now Smite's working correctly, which means that I cannot make use of this node, because I'm not directly using Smite, right? But because we have the helmet modifier, it says on Smite use, well, this counts as Smite being used. So this is our mana all being solved. So for our chest piece is really boring because there's not many ways of getting mods that scale the damage for this type of build. Normally your chest piece would have like plus levels of Smite or something like that, but our prefixes really don't help too much. When you start getting a chest piece that has a prefix of like Vitality, it's kind of boring, so like there's not much there. But we did end up with armor shred effect. So this, remember, like all damage, even elemental damage, is resisted by armor, and then armor shred can make it go negative. So this is still a way of scaling damage, even though it's not like the best way. We have a lot of shock chance in the build as well, coming in from Smite. Smite, shock, lightning damage. Remember that shock has shock lowers the enemy's lightning resistance. Armor shred, shock, like penetration is not a modifier that we're really looking for, which is why we don't have pen on our amulet. So we got crit multi, elemental damage. That's basically what we're going for on all of our gear. The weapon is just like 2 increased damage prefixes on a big adaptive base. I saw a question pop up on Reddit recently of r/last epoch asking to clarify what the differences are between these different words. So if you're familiar with Path of Exile, you probably already know this, but I'm going to run down it real quick because when I first started last epoch, I didn't know what adaptive spell damage was, and somebody had to clarify that for me as well. So adaptive spell damage is like your flat spell damage. So like maybe you're casting Fireball on an enemy, and Fireball's base damage at level 1 is 10. And then you have some increased modifiers, and then you have a bunch of more modifiers, right? So the increase and more are the same in Path of Exile here, but the 10 base damage from Fireball at level 1, for example, adaptive spell damage is flat damage that goes onto the base. So like if I use this on a Fireball character, it would say, okay, instead of 10, we're going to have 10 plus 61, so we're going to have 71 flat damage, and then that's going to go into the equation and be modified by all of our increased modifiers, and then also by all of our multiplicative multipliers, which in Path of Exile terms is a more multiplier. So the adaptive spell damage, the reason it says adaptive is like instead of just being lightning spell damage or plus fire spell damage, it's adaptive to whatever spell you're using. So because I have Smite here and I've converted the Smite fire damage to lightning damage. The game knows that, so this adaptive spell damage just becomes base lightning damage. Okay, cool. So then beyond that, elemental damage, spell damage, lightning damage, all of those things, percent increased generic damage, like from attunement, because Smite is scaled with attunement if you hold down Alt and take a look at it. All of those increases, they're all the exact same. So 122% increased elemental damage would be exactly the same as 122% increased lightning damage. Those are all the exact same. They got different words on them. It's to distinguish which ones are going to roll higher, which ones are going to roll lower. So if you take a look at this and I hold down Alt, you see that the elemental damage goes between 96 to 122, and it's tier 6. And my tier 5 modifier, it goes from 70 to 105, right? So I guess I'd have to pull this up on a website, but the rules of which ones roll higher follow the same rules of which ones would roll higher in Path of Exile. So I'm going to keep drawing comparisons there in case you're familiar with it. Elemental damage is a broader category, so it's going to have a lower top end, and lightning damage is a more specific category, so it's going to have a higher top end. So if both of these were tier 6 modifiers on the screen here, you'd see that like the tier 6 lightning damage would go higher than 122, even though the elemental damage modifier only goes from 96 to 122, because one's more specific and one's more broad, right? You can imagine maybe there's a category out there that says percent increased damage, and that's about as generic as it gets. And that one would have like the lowest top end because it applies to the most number of things, right? That's kind of how those things work. Fireball has an effectiveness of 1.25. Effectiveness of added damage is a good point. Fireball has a damage effectiveness of 1.25, which means that if you're adding 61 adaptive spell damage to it, it's going to be multiplied by 1.25, the effectiveness of added damage, and then that will be added to the base. So that's kind of like how these adaptive things and flat things, elemental, spell, all those things, kind of a rundown of how damage works in this game, equating it back to Path of Exile if you're familiar with that kind of thing. Rest of the gear, give you a rundown of what this character is doing. On prefixes of both of our rings, we have minus mana cost. So these were important to me before I had infinite mana. Currently, I have infinite mana because I've got mana again on Smite use. But in the past, I prioritized getting these -3 throwing attack mana cost so that I could have nice and easy mana and not worry about my mana. So this was important to me in the past. I augmented that with these nodes here. This is -1 mana cost per point in the ballista in the hammer throwing tree, trying to get my mana cost as low as possible so that I wouldn't have mana issues. Currently, because we just got this helmet recently, that's no longer an issue. So maybe I can get a different prefix modifier on these rings instead. But I'll keep working on that. For our belt, we just have a bunch of life and percent life as a suffix. The other prefix would be percent increased damage once we get there, but we haven't upgraded beyond this yet. For the gloves, now that we have infinite mana, we can scale attack speed as hard as we want because we're no longer gated by attack speed and our use of mana, right? So now we have tier 5 throwing attack speed on these, which is 23% increased throwing speed, which is great. Means that we're throwing stuff nice and fast, proccing a bunch of smites as quickly as we possibly can. Our boots have a bunch of crit avoidance, life, and then we also have, most importantly, tier 5 smite, which is +2 to smite. So the chest piece has no interesting text on it. Nothing on our chest piece scales damage, aside from this armor shred stuff. Our helmet is pretty boring as well, aside from the mana gain on smite use. But we don't really have any way of scaling damage. And most of the time in Last Epoch, it looks like your helmet often has some prefixes that matter for your build that give you some extra damage. But for us, the +2 to smite appears on the relic, so it's important for us to get this here. We have a little bit of damage leeches life as well, but that's not really what's most important. Most important part about this is just the +2 to smite. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 going on. Let me give you a quick rundown of the skills here. Skills, we have hammer throw, lunge for movement speed, holy aura, because we're a paladin, we get a bunch of passive benefits from this. Smite, we don't care about penalizing the cast speed, but we do care about this thing having as much damage as possible. And then we also have Sigil of Hope, which we gain passively by killing stuff, 6% chance to summon one of these whenever we kill an enemy, and then they last for 15 seconds plus 10, 25 seconds, I believe. So let's go through hammers first. While we're leveling up, we leveled with hammer actually dealing the damage. So we were clicking on things that say like chance to deal double damage, maybe some more damage here, maybe some attack speed down here. And then our first priority was 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way into Hammer Vortex to make sure that they would actually spiral around us like this. Now that we're not using hammers for damage and we're only using them for utility, again, because we have infinite mana, we spec'd out a Ballista here, and we've spec'd into things on the bottom side of the tree. Staggering Force has Armor Shred on it, so that scales the rest of our damage as well, because it shreds, it debuffs the enemy. We have some increased critical strike chance coming in from Guardian Zeal, and then our hammers are super slow, which means they last longer, which means they're hitting stuff more often with weighted hammers. We don't really care about the 75 damage here, but we do care about the minus prod speed, so that's important for us to keep these hammers moving super slow. Oh my god, they look so good. Lunge is basically just a bunch of buffs that we get for having lunged recently. We have +1 charge for lunge, and also a tiny bit of stun chance over here. These are the last 2 points that I spec'd into. I don't really care about these two, but these first 18 points, I feel really good about these. So this is +1 charge, the points that get to +1 charge, and then we have take no damage while lunging, which is great for quality of life, keeping us nice and safe if we have to dodge through something. And then we have initiative, increased effective initiative, the damage, the crit chance. Yeah, that's why we're over here. Next up is Holy Aura. Holy Aura is just a bunch of modifiers that are active all the time because we have it on our skill bar on the bottom. And then when we click it, we double all of these. So we have a little bit of resistance. We have a lot of speed. This is chance to gain haste as well, so like a throwing speed. And then we spec all the way over into attack speed, crit chance, and crit multiplier. So that's why we're here. From Smite, so we don't care about penalizing our cast speed because we're triggering stuff as much as possible. So we have +10 base crit, and then we have a little bit of crit multi down here, 100%. 100%? That's so big. What the hell? So we have our crit chance, we have our crit multi, and then we've only spec'd 1 point into sacrifice. We've tried speccing 2 and 3 points into this thing, but because we hit so quickly, we die. We're only taking 1 point in sacrifice because it is a 50% more damage multiplier. If I could figure out any way of getting like life gain on hit, or maybe like a ton of leech or a ton of regen, maybe I could spec more into this, but currently we're only spec'ing the 1 point because we can't quite sustain the life cost beyond that, even though we have 3 points down here as well. These rest of the points, we have 5 points into shock effect, so there's 100% chance to shock and shock effect, and the rest of this is what? Converting the damage to lightning just to get there, and what is this? Extra AoE? Extra AoE, Smite costs more mana, this doesn't really matter. And then if we didn't have the +2, I think I would spec out of maybe one of these atonement nodes for crit, and maybe one of these charged hand nodes for a shock chance and shock effect. I think those are the two that I would drop if I only had 20 points instead of 22 points. Sigil of Hope doesn't do too much for it, but we are proccing these on kill, and then on bosses we can just like wind up 4 of these and they last for 25 seconds, so that's not too bad. We get a little bit of damage per sigil. I think it's 3 sigils by default, and then we have +1 up here. So we have 4 sigils for all these modifiers. So this is about 100% increased damage, about, what, maybe 650, 700 armor that we're getting from having these things active as well. And then a little bit of life regeneration, a little bit of block chance. I think it's 15 times 4. It should be 12. 12 block chance here, right? So just a couple things here and there. But this is, I think, worthwhile. If we weren't doing Sigil of Hope here, I think you might spec into something like Shield Bash in order to get some extra block, get some extra stun on enemies. This would be a possibility, but I think just having the passive benefits from something like Sigil of Hope is going to be better in most scenarios. So I think I'm into it. Does that cover the gear? Does that cover the character? We have a shield here as well. I don't think I talked about this at the very beginning, but our shield has an enormous amount of block chance on it. And it probably needs some life. It probably needs a little bit higher numbers somewhere, but just the fact that this thing has almost 1,000 block effectiveness and 48% chance to block is, to me, absurd. So we're happy enough with this for the short term, but in the long term, we want like some life modifiers as a suffix as well. Why spec into Lunge? It's a good question. So Lunge gives us initiative. It says our increased damage is 40%, and then increased critical strike chance is 40 as well. So 40 damage, 40 crit. And then we also gain another 200% increased critical strike chance just by dashing. In terms of mobility, we have +1 charge, so we can dash twice in quick succession. And then we take no damage while we're lunging, so we can lunge through a dangerous scenario without taking damage. So that's pretty good. I guess lunge you could take out of it. You could spec into shield bash for like stun and block chance. I think that might be another consideration. But other than that, no, I'm pretty happy spec'ing the lunge. I think it's a good idea. In any case, yeah, I think that just about does it. So this is Pineapple's build. We're going to keep playing it until we die. But we just got to empowered monoliths. I guess we can go do a little, our first level 100 piece of content real quick. You want to do that? It's our first level 100 piece of content, hey? 135 crit chance? Yo, something, yo. Let's go ahead and do this. Can we run through here? There we go. It looks so good, doesn't it? The reduced projectile speed feels really, really good. Let's pop Juggernaut stance. Stand here for a bit, blow things up. There we go. And you can see just kind of walking around, we have our 4 sigil modifiers right down here. So we are getting those 6% chance on kill. Yeah. I think the build's going to transition into empowered monoliths just fine. Feels good, man. Look at the deeps. Holy crap, the deeps. So we're going to keep doing this. We need to kill a quest boss for like any of these monoliths now that we're in empowered monoliths. And then we also need to kill a Shade of Aerobis eventually. So those are like the last 2 things that we'll work on, but not quite yet. Just want to give you an update about how the character's looking so far. And yeah, feels good, man. Feels pretty flippin' good, yeah?